It does not follow from his nature because it's perfect. Reality is just what God causes, and nothing more, nothing less. Here is another interesting passage connected with the issue, and it's the next passage on the sheet. I confess that this opinion, which subjects all things to a certain indifferent will of God and makes all things depend on his good pleasure, is nearer to the truth than that of those who maintain that God does all things for the sake of the good. Good pleasure means just because he felt like it. It's a sort of technical term in theology. Just because he felt like doing it, not because he had any good reason for it. So he's saying his view is closer to that view than to those who maintain that God does things for the sake of good. For they seem to place something outside God which does not depend on God, to which God attends as a model in what he does, and at which he aims as a certain goal. This is simply to subject God to fate. Nothing more absurd can be maintained about God, whom we have shown to be the first and only free cause, both of the essence of all things and of their existence. So I'll waste no more time in refuting this absurdity. In this passage, Spinoza introduces what we might call the divine good pleasure account of how things happen. On this view, things happen in the world only because of God's good pleasure. He does things, but there's no reason why he does them, beside the fact that he just wants them. Spinoza does not want to hold exactly this position because he does not want to attribute a will to God, at least not as part of his nature. But he does have a certain sympathy for the view, just as the good pleasure theorist does not think that God acts for a reason. Spinoza, I think, also holds that there's no reason why God's nature entails this rather than that series. Which is to say, God's nature is just what it is, and this is where all reasons stop. Whatever may follow from the divine nature is real and perfect. The two are the same. But you can't ask why God's nature is such that A follows rather than B. While it entails Harry but not Eunice, why it entails Harry but not Eunice, it just does. And this seems pretty brute to me. That is to say, there's no reason why God's nature is this way rather than that. So it seems to me that there is a brute fact in this world, rather than, it is a brute fact that this world rather than some other world follows from the divine nature. Something that goes beyond any human capacity for understanding. Now, none of this violates the principles of intelligibility that Spinoza actually endorses. Harry has a cause in this infinite series of causes, and Eunice does not, satisfying the principle of proposition 28. And in the infinite series with Harry has God's nature as its cause, but the infinite series with Eunice does not. So there's a reason for the existence and non-existence of Harry and Eunice, satisfying the proposition 11 definition 2 principle. Moreover, everything in the infinite series that exists satisfies the laws of nature. But at the heart, there's something for which a reason cannot be given. Why God's nature is such that one series follows from it and the other doesn't. And this looks to me like a brute fact, not in violation of any principle of intelligibility that Spinoza explicitly endorses, but in violation of the strong version of the PSR that Michael reads into Spinoza. So, let me summarize where we are at this point. I'd agree that Spinoza certainly does believe that the world is largely intelligible and largely intelligible to us. But even so, this falls short of Spinoza the super-rationalist. And so far as I can see, there are no grounds for attributing to the actual historical Spinoza the very strong version of the PSR that Michael has attributed to you, the claim that there are no brute facts at all. I think at this point I'm going to skip to one thing further to say about this is that there are reasons, okay, one doesn't want to attribute, I think, the version of the PSR this strong to Spinoza. The other thing that I would want to argue in more detail if I had a bit more time is that as a matter of fact, it's wrong to see Spinoza as motivated solely by, you know, his metaphysics in this way and by something like the PSR. I would point to that last passage on the third page, which is the opening of the treatise on the imitation of the intellect, which gives a different picture of Spinoza. I think that there is another strand. There certainly is a strong metaphysical strand in Spinoza, but there's another sort of ethical and another political strand, where the project is not simply to figure out, you know, what substance, what's attribute, what's mode, how are they related, and so on, but how should we as human beings live in this terrifying world that we're living in? And, you know, a world without meaning, a world in which God has no, a world in which God has no purpose, in which God is utterly unintelligible to us. And how should we live with one another? And this is the political dimension of Spinoza's project. And I resist seeing these as, in some way or another, deriving from a commitment to an abstract principle of intelligibility like the PSR. These are, you know, important ethical and political motivations that really illuminate a lot of Spinoza's work as well. And one needs to put them in as well, in addition to what Michael is reading as the central commitment to the PSR. So let me end with some final thoughts. Whither superheroes in the history of philosophy? Despite the somewhat critical tone of my remarks, I by no means mean to dismiss Michael's project. While we certainly, you'll have your chance in a moment. While we certainly have a number of substantive differences about how to read Spinoza's philosophy, probably deeper are the methodological differences about what one is doing when you're doing the history of philosophy. I strongly suspect that Michael knows perfectly well that what he is concerned with in his book, Spinoza, is not exactly the historical Spinoza, but a kind of rational reconstruction of Spinoza's project. I pointed out that in many places Michael does not say that this is what Spinoza says, but only that this is what he could say, or that this would make sense of the conclusions that he reaches, even if he did not use this reasoning to get there. It's Spinoza shorn of historical contingencies, Spinoza purified, the interesting philosophical program that underlies what the perhaps imperfectly rational and imperfectly rationalist Spinoza actually wrote. Now, this is not meant to be dismissive in any way. Rational reconstruction has a long and noble history. Imre Lakatos, for example, famously suggested that when writing the history of science, one should put the rational reconstruction in the text and the actual contingent history in the footnotes, indicating, quote, how actual history misbehaved in the light of its rational reconstruction. Needless to say, he got a little bit of pushback on that. Similarly, in a wonderful essay on methodology in the history of philosophy, Lisa Downing talks about a practice at Princeton in the late 1980s, when she was a student. Rather than talking about Spinoza, one would talk about Spinoza's star. This gave one the freedom to develop a philosopher's views in a systematic way, without worrying too much about whether the philosopher in question actually saw everything that we can see in his or her position. As a style of doing history of philosophy, this seems perfectly defensible. It has its drawbacks, but it also has advantages in allowing the commentator philosophical freedom and in allowing her the ability to play up the philosophically interesting bits in a philosopher's corpus. In addition to being a kind of rational reconstruction, Michael Spinoza is created as a kind of ideal type, the ideal type of the rationalist. Superheroes in the history of philosophy play an important role in philosophical argumentation. The history of philosophy so read is the source of archetypes for philosophical argumentation. Such ideal types, rationalists and empiricists, for example, have a number of roles to play in contemporary argument. They can provide models for how we might work out positions on philosophical issues, both philosophical issues that have been confronted in the past and those that our ancestors hadn't dealt with. They define camps that can be opposed to one another to define positions and clarify issues. In this way, they can provide touchstones for positions taken or rejected or proposed. One can, for example, use them as idealized opponents. Quote, contrary to what the rationalist might say, I would say, blah, blah, blah. Or as a reference point for a position taken. Like the empiricists, I hold that, blah, blah, blah. In this way, they can be regarded as a shorthand for a series of doctrines that hang together in a certain way, even if no actual historical figure ever instantiates all of those doctrines. And in this respect, it's sometimes useful to give these clusters of doctrines distinctive names so that they can more easily be referenced, as Spinoza held, meaning the idealized Spinoza, not necessarily the historical figure of that name. They also have roles to play as models for how we fashion ourselves as philosophers. They give us one conception of how the philosophical enterprise works. On this view, we choose to belong to a camp, which gives us a certain guidance in how we work out positions on particular issues. And this way, they kind of function like Kuhnian paradigms. And finally, they can be very useful as pedagogical tools for teaching figures in the history of philosophy. They give us a key to understanding complex historical figures and explaining them to our students. One way of helping our students to enter into the history of philosophy is through these kinds of simplifications and, as it were, purifications of the complex historical figures, making them more intelligible and more easily comprehensible to beginning students. Personally, I prefer real historical figures in all their complexity. While superheroes have their place, I prefer the satisfaction that can come from immersing oneself in the twists and turns, the ambiguities and inconsistencies of real historical thinkers. Even so, the consideration of superheroes in the history of philosophy raises interesting and important methodological issues about how one does the history of philosophy and why one does the history of philosophy. Thank you for your attention.
Jim, can you pass out the handout?
I think your handout may be bigger than mine.
We should put a sign in front of the catering saying that they shouldn't take it. Because they will, because they'll come out of that. They got me.
So did I. Yeah, we'll have to. We'll get through something. We'll copy of it. We'll actually fix it. I hope so. Yeah.
Okay, while the handout's going around, I'm basically going to talk you through the handout. And we'll see how far we get. I just wanted to thank Dan for suggesting this whole thing, both the actual written exchange, which will be coming out, but also suggesting, we had invited Dan to come up to Yale, Julia and Matt did, a while ago, just independently of all this. And but then it was Dan suggested that we should present this exchange at this event, and I'm really excited about that. So
we'll see at the end whether it was a good idea.
well, yeah, I don't know. And Dan, despite some disagreements on minor matters here, I think Dan, no, really, we have a lot more in common philosophically, I think, than not. And Dan's always been very generous to me going way back. I remember we were both in Berlin for a conference a few years ago. We arrived early. It was Valentine's Day, actually. And So we were there early as the two of the Americans, and we were trying to get over jet lag. So we spent the whole day walking miles and miles through Berlin. It was a very memorable day for me, and talking about philosophy, but very pleasantly about other things too. So there's lots of things that we agree on.
We actually first met in Berlin
In
more than
Jerusalem.
20 years ago.
In Jerusalem.
I'm sorry, in Jerusalem.
Same.
More than.
Yeah. But that was for a memorable conference too, the
Yes.
Spinoza conference there, and you gave a great paper on part 4 of the ethics.
Oh, you gave one on part 4 of the ethics?
Well, it was a conference on part 4 of the ethics. Yours was on the I.B. Singer short story, Dr.
Right.
Fisherson's Dilemma,
Right.
and that was very nice. It's interesting. There's differences in our approaches, but one thing I take good pleasure in is that one of my sharpest critics about the way I use the PSR in Spinoza is not just that, but Yitzhak Melamed, my student, and he's sort of, not that he's taking your side, but he's been one of my sharpest critics on the PSR, and one of more or less a big defender of my approach is Martin Lin, who's Dan's student. So, I take pleasure in that. Yitzhak, of course, he's my former student, and now because of this agreement, he's my late student. But we have so it's interesting that students, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, I really was eager when Dan suggested, is that I've always refrained from getting too methodological until recently in my work, but I thought it might be helpful for students to see where there are differences and where there aren't differences in our approaches, and that's the hope. I'm sure that's one of Dan's hopes in doing this. So I have the handout here which summarizes my response, and a key part of for Dan is that to distinguish what I call the weak PSR, that each thing that exists has an explanation, from the strong PSR, the no brute fact version of the PSR. The strong version is that each fact has an explanation. So that distinction is going to be important for a lot of Dan's paper and for a lot of response. But Dan's absolutely right that the PSR structures my interpretation of Spinoza. It's kind of an overarching principle that I think can shed a lot of light on Spinoza's metaphysics, his epistemology, philosophy of mind, his moral and political philosophy, his theory of biblical interpretation. I think it's, I didn't come at this lightly. I've been studying Spinoza for years, but it just seemed to make sense, and you can really solve a lot of interpretive puzzles by seeing Spinoza as using the PSR in this thoroughgoing way. And Dan did a great job of summarizing the various uses to which I want to put the PSR. One thing that Dan acknowledges that he doesn't mention is that what I call the twofold use of the PSR is really important for my reading. Didn't play a role in Dan's comments, and it's fine, but just to show how systematic it is. So there's a twofold use of the PSR. A given phenomenon, for example, causation or inherence, that has an explanatory demand attached to it by its very nature. So this a demand that we must give an account of what causation is. We must explain what causation is. That's the first fold in the twofold use of the PSR, the demand for explanation of any given phenomenon. And then the second fold in the twofold use is that that phenomenon, causation for example, is explained in terms of explanation itself. And what it is for one thing to cause another thing is for the first thing to make the other intelligible, as it were, to serve as the explanation for a thing. So there's an explanatory demand, and the answer to the explanatory demand is, in very many cases, I think I counted 17 at least cases in the book, the phenomenon is explained, the explanatory demand is met, by appealing to the notion of explanation itself. Causation is a kind of intelligibility. Inherence is a kind of intelligibility. And most generally, existence demands an explanation. What is it for a thing to exist? That's a philosophical question. And Spinoza is raising it, I take it. And that demand is met by saying that the existence of a thing is just the intelligibility of a thing. To be is to be intelligible, to use one of my idealist slogans. So I think that's an important use for me. I think the story is really an exciting story to tell. I was happy to tell this story in the paper, in the book, and in this paper, and I'm happy to continue telling the story. It's exciting, I think, for me at least, and so I like that. So to be intelligible is one of the strands in my interpretation, and the real is the rational. Real is the twofold juice of the PSR that's behind a lot of the idealist themes in my interpretation of Spinoza. And some people have accused me of reviving an idealist interpretation of Spinoza, and I've made my peace with that. I've accepted that. Yeah, I do have an idealist interpretation of Spinoza. In some respects, an idealist interpretation of Spinoza. Exactly what that amounts to, that's a nice question, but yeah, that's, I'm happy to be that way. Now Dan is making two kinds of challenges to me, and first order challenges, that's the bulk of his paper, and second order or methodological challenges to me, or just raising questions about methodological differences. I think at one point in his paper, Dan said the methodological issues are perhaps the most interesting, and I think that's right. I think that's it's hard to get clear on them. So I'll spend some time on the methodological differences, but I'll also talk about the first order challenges. So both kinds of challenges. So we're going to get a real Spinoza workout and things to Dan. So there are two basic first order challenges Dan is raising. That there's no evidence for seeing Spinoza as relying on the strong version of the PSR that I attribute to Spinoza. And the second first order challenge is that there's a big brute fact in Spinoza's system, and that is problematic for my overall interpretation. The second order points, just to summarize, is that Dan prefers direct readings of Spinoza, as opposed to a rational reconstruction, which is perhaps less direct. And so that's a methodological difference in it, and that's expressing Dan's preference for direct reading. He's getting at, as he says, the real historical Spinoza, and I just have the ideal type Spinoza as a superhero. Just to summarize my own view, I think that Spinoza is not a superhero. He's super, and he's my hero. But he's not a superhero. But I think he's a philosopher using ordinary methods of reasoning, plus a whole lot of hard work to reach radical conclusions. So we'll come back to that at the end, about when we get to the methodological points. In terms of responding to these points, and this is just an overview of where this paper is going, about the first challenge that there's no evidence of seeing strong PSR in Spinoza, I'm going to try to show that there is good textual evidence for seeing Spinoza as committed to the strong PSR, not just to the weak PSR. And about the particular brute fact that Dan spent a lot of time, the Eunice and Harry brute fact, I do not think that's actually a brute fact in Spinoza's system. So we'll look at that. And that's not to say that there are no brute facts in Spinoza's system. Dan mentioned some briefly, and I'm sympathetic to those being brute facts. So we'll talk about the implications of that later on. And then in terms of responding to the second order, not so much criticisms, but the contrast that Dan was offering in terms of methodology, I'm going to try to give my own characterization of the methodological differences. Because some of the differences Dan was pointing to, I think, are not genuine. Some are genuine, and it's important to see what's at stake there. So we'll come back to that. Before we get to the responses to the objections, I just want to make a couple of observations, preliminary observations. I go between Roman numerals and letters on the hand. I don't know, it's kind of confusing. And now I'm at 3 lowercase Roman numeral 1. My aim is to defend the approach of Russell and Williams. Yeah. So I think Dan very generously says that my approach is similar to the approach of Russell in his book on Leibniz, which is a great book on Leibniz. You should all read it. And then Bernard Williams' book on Descartes, also a great book on Descartes. These are books I grew up with. I mean, these are wonderful books. And Russell has this overarching interpretation of Leibniz's philosophy that's driven by, not the PSR, but Leibniz's logic. That was Russell's whole thing. And it was a lot like Russell's logic. And but he had this overarching view, and it didn't work in some places, but it really revived Leibniz scholarship, and that's actually a work it's over 100 years old. It's 115 years old, I guess.
1900, I think.
Yeah, and but it's still very, very useful. And you know, we had a Spinoza seminar here a couple of years ago, and then I taught it with Julia Girardi and Tom Feeney, and we
Leibniz?
on Leibniz seminar.
Oh, Leibniz.
Yeah, we can tell you that.
No, you said Spinoza.
Oh no, I see it's the problem. It's a Leibniz seminar, and we focused at the beginning a lot on Russell's book, so it's really useful. Russell's book, Bernard's book, Williamson's book is not as much read nowadays, I think, but I think it was still a very influential book on Descartes. So in one of my aims here is to trying to articulate what the methodological differences is, try to indicate the value of that kind of approach to philosophy. It's not just to the history of philosophy. It's not just Williams. It's not just Russell. It's other people too who have this kind of approach. And it's worth thinking about what's at stake there. The other preliminary observation is that Dan mentioned that this pure rationalist, as it were, version of Spinoza first appears with me, and as much as I'd like to take credit for it, it's not. I wasn't the first. So Jacobi in the 1780s, I guess it was, really articulated this kind of reading of Spinoza. Really is totally driven by the PSR. He comes up with a lot of the same conclusions I do. I hadn't really studied Jacobi when I came up with this, but then when I made a proposal for this book as part of the series, as part of the series, and the series is edited by Brian Leiter, by the way. So I had a lot of back and forth with Brian. And then I had this proposal, and then Fred Beiser sent me a letter. And I remember this because it was a letter, and it was not an email. It was the last communication I had by actually a letter in my life. And but Fred said, this is really good. He thought it was really interesting, and you should really check out the Jacobi more, because the Jacobi had this kind of PSR structured interpretation of Spinoza. I mean, for that reason, Jacobi saw Spinoza this way. I thought he it was a good interpretation. He rejected Spinoza. He thought that the conclusions were crazy, and this led to German idealism. It led to Romanticism. It's really important. So we're just recapitulating that history now. Anyway, so I'm not the first to have this radical rationalist reading of Spinoza. It actually is at the origins of German idealism. Another point is that it is a rationalist reading, and I'm adopting a version of rationalism which is centered around the PSR. It's rationalism, and as I'm using the terms, is the commitment to the PSR, perhaps in the strong form of the PSR. There could be other versions of rationalism, and those will be fine too, and might be interestingly connected to the PSR. But one of the benefits of having this kind of understanding of rationalism in terms of the PSR, it sort of undermines the rationalist-empiricist contrast, because even an empiricist, someone who privileges sensory knowledge in some sense, empirical knowledge, could still accept the PSR, that every fact has an explanation, or each thing that exists has an explanation. So one can be an empiricist and still be a rationalist in my sense. So I think at one or 2 points in Dan's paper, he's drew the rationalist-empiricist contrast. And I don't think that's the best way to see my Spinoza, because a rationalist, in my sense, could still also be an empiricist too. Okay, let's go to Dan's first order criticism of me, and that's that Spinoza is committed to the weak PSR, but not to the strong PSR. And the key passage is on Dan's handout, and it's on mine, what I'll always say is thank God for this passage, right? 1P11D2, for each thing, there must be assigned a cause, both for its existence and for its non-existence. That seems to imply that each thing both exists and doesn't exist, right? We'll let that pass. So what Dan points out correctly, that this is about things, race, not about facts, right? So it might be an expression of something like the weak PSR, but it's not an expression of the strong PSR, the no-proof fact version of the PSR. Okay, so that's one of my important bits of textual evidence, but it seems to fall short of where I want to take it. And then a couple of things in response to that. One, just very briefly, is that I'm not sure that Spinoza accepts the whole thing-fact distinction. I think I'd like to see a lot of textual evidence that Spinoza actually would say, hey, I'm talking about things, man, I'm not talking about facts. Right? There could be a distinction, and that could play a role, but exactly, if it does play a role, that would need to be shown. So I'm skeptical about the thing-fact distinction, which Dan's drawing a distinction between the weak and the strong PSR turns on. That's one thing. The other response to this is, and I think it's a powerful objection, and I wasn't as careful in the book as I should have been about talking about facts. I moved very quickly to no proof fact claim, and I should have acknowledged that on its face, 1P11D2 is just about things. So that's something that I should have been more careful about, and Dan's very right to raise this. Nonetheless, I think there is a pretty direct path from the weak PSR to the strong PSR, at least for Spinoza. So here's a little argument. So assume that there is a brute fact. It doesn't matter what the brute fact is. Okay. Now, given substance monism, this fact, like any fact, can be expressed as the fact that the substance, God, is F for some property F. It doesn't matter what the property is. But if there's a brute fact, then you can express any fact in terms of substances being F. Or substance being in a certain state, the state of being F. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. So just for example, so I'm wearing kind of a brown shirt today, right? So I have the property of wearing a brown shirt. So that can be expressed as Michael's wearing a brown, Michael, apostrophe, wearing a brown shirt. And that can be expressed as Michael being in the state of wearing a brown shirt. So there's a fact associated with me, and then there's a corresponding state. In substance monism, if there's a brute fact, then that fact goes along with substances being F for a certain property, and it goes along with there being a corresponding state of the substance. So if there's an unexplained fact, then there's going to be an unexplained state of the substance. So assuming there's an unexplained fact, then there's going to be an unexplained state of the substance. But a state of a substance is a thing. And this, we can see this by showing that for Spinoza, modes are things, and modes are states of the substance. Modes are particular states of the substance, right? So particular properties of the substance, as it were, right? So you and I are just modes of God, and as I'm understanding the mode-substance relation, we're just affections of God, ways in which God exists. Modes are literally ways in which God exists. So modes are, as it were, states of God. And Spinoza says that these modes, these states, are things. So if there's an unexplained fact, there has to be an unexplained state, but an unexplained state would be an unexplained thing. So there's the connection right there between the two versions of the PSR. So given the assumption that there's a brute fact, there's also an unexplained thing. So we have a violation of the strong PSR, we'll also have a violation of the weak PSR. So there's going to be a direct path connecting these two versions of the PSR. So I'm not too worried, at least on the basis of this passage, I'm not too worried that 1P11D2 is stated in terms of things and not facts, because given Spinoza's other commitments, particularly given his commitment to each fact being expressible as the state of the substance, the states being things, you're going to get some kind of connection between the two versions of the PSR. Now you could, Dan or any of the rest of you could challenge this by rejecting the claim, for example, that modes are states of the substance. And this is actually Curley's interpretation of Spinoza. Curley thinks, hey, no, modes are things, modes are not properties or affections of substance, despite the fact that Spinoza says that modes are affections. Okay. You can respond to, you can short-circuit this argument by going Curley-esque on you and just denying that modes are states. But I think that, and there's been a lot of debate, and I'm happy to have that debate. Yitzhak sort of redeemed himself by challenging Curley on this point. I think he did a great job. He had like an 80-page paper in PPR on this and demolishing Curley's interpretation. I think it was a great paper. So he defended that modes are states, and so that I'm relying on that view too, in this little argument here. That's just one thing. Something else I want to just point to is, and this raises actually a methodological question. At one point, Dan suggests that I stretch the meaning of the word thing beyond plausibility. I stretch it to include facts, and that's to stretch it beyond plausibility. Maybe that's right. Maybe it's a big stretch. I have a little argument here, but it might seem to be a stretch. I think that's right, that it's maybe an implausible use of the word thing, but I think it's a little odd to use this in the context of Spinoza, because in some sense, Spinoza is all about stretching the meanings of our words beyond plausibility, right? He talks about God. God is, not the traditional sense, God is nature or something like that, right? That seems to be a stretching of the term. Causation is, well, depending on your theory of causation, whatever causation is in Spinoza, it's going to be something that you wouldn't recognize as causation. It's some kind of reason. It's an inherence, being in, is stretched beyond plausibility. So Spinoza is all about stretching the meanings of terms all over the place. So I wouldn't put too much weight on the fact that I might be stretching the meaning of the word thing there. So that's something. It's nothing conclusive. Something to say about the 1P11B2 bit of evidence. The other passage that Dan was right to focus on is that I invoke at this point is axiom 2 of part 1, supporting the PSR. Whatever cannot be conceived through another must be conceived through itself. So everything's conceived either through itself or through another. I think Yulia told me yesterday that about a student who interpreted conceive here as being conceived in the sense of getting pregnant. That is stretching the meaning of it. That's not how I interpret it, right? So if everything is conceived either through itself or through another, right? And for Spinoza, I think, to conceive a thing is to explain it, right? So everything, I interpret that as saying that everything is explained either through itself or through another. That's sort of the version of the PSR. I mean, it may be the thing-oriented version of the PSR, but again, I have a path from the thing-oriented version to the fact-oriented version of the PSR. This is another case where Dan might find that use, understanding of conceiving as explaining is implausible, but I really think there is textual evidence for it, and there's a footnote in my book showing how Spinoza glides very easily from talking about ways in which God is conceived to ways in which God is explained. He's talking about the same kind of thing. The substance is conceived through, it's explained through its attributes. He goes back and forth between those. So it's not clear that Spinoza himself is going to draw any kind of sharp distinction between conceiving and explaining. And if he's not, then axiom 2 of part 1 could be seen as expressing a version of the PSR. And there might be other passages too. I didn't bring in other passages, but Martin Lin has a good paper, a really good paper that's forthcoming, where he sees basically each of the axioms of part 1 as supporting a version of the PSR when properly understood. So it's, he would be supporting a more general PSR interpretation, even more textual evidence than I was given. Okay, let's go to Dan's other main first-order criticism, the big brute fact. This is a movie in the 1950s, the big brute fact. It was a horror movie, and now here it is. So again, 2 preliminary points about Dan's criticism here. And the first one is actually really important. Even if there is a brute fact in Spinoza's system, so what? Why does it matter? At most, this shows that despite his fundamental commitment to the PSR, he got into trouble, right? He didn't actually realize that he was committed or was getting into brute facts in some place. So the fact that there may be a brute fact in Spinoza's system, that by itself wouldn't challenge the PSR-driven interpretation of Spinoza. He could still see the PSR as fundamental, even if there is a brute fact. And a further point I want to make here, and I've made this in one other paper, is that it might be that Spinoza can see the PSR as fundamental, structuring the entire system, and also welcome violations of the PSR. So he may have some kind of room in the system for violations of the PSR. And he could do that perhaps if the violations of the PSR has some kind of lesser ontological status. And I think there's some indication that he does that the violations of the PSR are less real, they exist to a lesser degree. So maybe violations of the PSR do have, brute facts do have some kind of place in the system, but only in this kind of halfway house of being, as it were, right? That's actually a possibility too, so even if there is a brute fact in Spinoza's system, that might be something you can embrace in his way. But Dan does mention, besides the big brute fact which we're going to get to, other potential brute facts. I'll just list them here. Dan mentioned them. That we can know only two attributes. The division between substance and attributes also might be a brute fact, and the distinction among three kinds of knowledge might be a brute fact. I think with regard to the first one, that we can know only two attributes, I think it's not true that we know only two attributes. I think we know them all, in a certain weird sense in Spinoza. I think it'll take me too long to explain that. But there is a sense in which I'm a mode under all the attributes, under attribute 3, unknown to us insofar as we're thinking about extension, we're thinking about bodies all the time. But there's a mode, there's me under attribute 3, and there's an idea of me under attribute 3. That's my mind under attribute 3. So there's another mind that's thinking of the mode of attribute 3 that's parallel to my mind here, which is thinking of my body. But it turns out for Spinoza, they were all one and the same thing anyway. So I am thinking about attribute 3, but only insofar as I'm a mind of a mode of attribute 3. Right now we're focusing on minds that are modes, ideas of bodies, but they're also minds that are ideas of modes of attribute 3. And so in some sense I do have ideas of all the other attributes. They just don't have access to it from insofar as we're thinking about bodies, we're not thinking about attribute 3. That's all a little speculative, but I think that's what one thing Spinoza can say. So I'm not sure there's a brute fact there. But I think the other two cases may well involve brute facts, so I'm not challenging that. I mean, the distinction between substance and attributes is a big problem. The notion of predication is a big problem. And the distinction between three kinds of knowledge, that's also, I think, it's hard to make that distinction in a principled way. That might be a brute fact too. So, but again, the fact that he may have some brute facts doesn't by itself, I think, challenge the view. But let's look at the big brute fact that Dan focuses on, the Harry, the horse, and unicorn brute fact. Dan is saying, look, the existence of Harry is not a brute fact because the existence of Harry is explained by the causes of Harry, which include other Harry's parents and whatever, and ultimately just determined by God's nature. So it's not a brute fact there, the existence of Harry. And the non-existence of Eunice is not a brute fact because the non-existence of Eunice is explained by the fact that it's not caused by God's nature, it's not entailed by God's nature. Dan says there still is a brute fact here. Namely, the brute fact is that God's nature entails Harry's existence, or entails H, the series with Harry's existence. And God's nature does not entail Eunice, or E, the series with Eunice being part of that series. That's the brute fact, not the brute fact that Harry exists and Eunice does not. But the brute fact is the fact that God's nature entails H, that series, instead of God's nature entailing E, the series with Eunice. And then, now this is going to get a little complicated here, but even if God's nature entails H and not E, it's not contradictory to say that E follows instead. Okay? It's not contradictory to say that E follows from God's nature, this series with Eunice. E doesn't follow from God's nature as it stands, but it's not contradictory. There's no inconsistency there. Because if it were contradictory for E to follow from God's nature, then that would be the reason that E does not follow from God's nature. If the existence of E involved a contradiction